University of Alberta in Midwestern Canada, and I'm going to be providing the webinar today. My email and my Twitter handle are there on the screen, so please feel free to contact me if you've got any questions. I am a professor at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Nursing, and I'm also chair of the board of the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology that some of you may have heard before. It's an organization that for over 22 years have provided training for qualitative research across disciplines all over the world, including some workshops that we have coming up in Edmonton in June. I'm delighted to be working with Quests on the webinar today on complexity. If you want to hashtag as we go along, then please use the hashtag Quests hashtag that you see on the screen there in the right hand side. And whilst I can't necessarily respond, well, given the webinar, I'll certainly respond afterwards. Small plug just before we carry on. I'm also editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, and if you are a methods geek, a methods fan, and you are writing about methods, perhaps as part of your PhD, or perhaps as part of your work generally, please consider IJQM for publishing your work. It's interdisciplinary and open access. It's diverse and influential. Many of our papers get cited and downloaded a lot. So please consider us next for that next wonderful methods paper that you're going to write. Well, this morning, we're going to be thinking in complex ways. And we're going to be thinking about what complexity is and what complexity is not. And we're also going to be thinking about some key terms, some key concepts that you may have heard about in relation to complexity research, such as, for example, thinking about what complexity is in complexity research, thinking about what components are, and when we use that term component to refer to the part of an intervention, what can and might that mean in different contexts based on different worldviews. We're going to be thinking too about mechanisms. What is a mechanism? Where does it have its role and its place in intervention research? How can qualitative research through different approaches be used to understand mechanisms better and not just measure if an intervention works or not, but then to understand why it works when it works and also why it doesn't when it doesn't. And finally, very important for those of us who are interested in qualitative research, writing context back in. Recognizing that interventions aren't decontextualized, that responsive, not only to the people providing them, the people receiving them potentially, but also to the broader context in which they're provided. And thinking about where that can fit in some of the more prominent methods that have been used around complexity research and interventions. Okay. Many of us will be familiar with the complexities of the world, no matter what research paradigm or what research methods we've used in the past. And in the last 5 years, this notion of complexity has really grown in quantitative research in relation to the presence of big data. And if you were to look around the research world the last 2 to 3 years, you would think big data is going to save the world, that this has been the big advance that we've been waiting for, and with more and more data collected in more and more different ways, automatically and in administrative data sets, we're going to get to the answers of some of our biggest questions about what works in society, in organizations, and in interventions. Not only big data, we've got more and more randomized controlled trials. These trials are being carried out across all different areas of a really well-established research methodology for intervention research. And these trials also produce curious results. And across many trials, we are seeing issues around replicability. This has been really well documented in psychology, for example, whereby we don't necessarily get more consensus with a higher number of trials. We're actually getting curiouser and curiouser results. And I think complexity methods have a really important part to play in not only understanding these curious results, but also understanding why they come about in the first place, why they are inevitable or even desirable. And when we approach research results like that with a complexity lens, it also asks questions about, well, what interventions even are? And we're going to be talking about some of those questions today through the webinar. Thinking not only about what research is, but what research we are doing on interventions and what reconceptualization of interventions these complexity worldviews provide. And across big data and across trials and across these interventions, making the case that actually we're understanding complexities across these realms far less than what we thought we would, and we need different methods, qualitative and quantitative, and well-informed theories and approaches to help understand these key complexities far more. Okay, so what are the themes that we're going to focus on in this webinar based on that view of understanding complexities more? Well, first of all, we're going to give an overview about what complexity is and is not, distinguishing it from concepts like simple and complicated. Then secondly, we're going to consider the implications of these approaches for trials and intervention research. And there'll be a chance at the end where we can have some discussion and some questions about these implications at the end. First of all, though, I'd like to address a key question in complexity research. And this key question relates to why. Why do we get the results we do from our intervention studies? Why don't sometimes we get the results that we do expect? Not just measuring intervention effects, but also understanding why we get those effects. And because of this kind of question, why type questions are really central to complexity approaches. And there's a special name for that, and that name is abduction. This step to consider why is a step in abductive thinking, looking beyond what we measure to try to ask why do we get the results that we get. This isn't induction or deduction, this is abduction, making the step from what we measure to why we are getting the results we are getting and trying to understand and explain them. So in the webinar today, we're going to be thinking time and time again in abductive ways, thinking about why we get the results that we get in our research, and why questions and why issues are all about us all the time. Why, when I look at my window, are the trees moving without anyone touching them? Might that be invisible ghosts? Might that be forces that we cannot comprehend or understand that are supernatural? Or might that be the movement of air from high pressure areas to low pressure areas, or as we conventionally call it, wind? Why sometimes do students who I work with screw their face up and make angry eyes at me when I start to talk about research methods? What's going on there in terms of social behavior to explain the various facial expressions and social cues that I'm getting from those around me? So why questions can be social as well as physical. And they can extend to many different areas, some of which can be measurable. So for example, in meteorology, why did it rain in Glasgow yet again today? And across all these realms, social, physical, meteorological, why questions are central. And we explore why questions in relation to research a lot as well. And these why questions are essentially about complexity. Why, for example, do we see that the global recession happened in 2009, affecting economies all over the world? And this realm of research, so-called econometrics, is some of the most sophisticated quantitative research in the world. But despite this manifold complexity, we still don't really understand why the global recession did happen in 2009, despite the most sophisticated quantitative methods being used with the most sophisticated equations and mindsets. We still don't really understand why that recession happened. Why, for example, do some people exercise after a heart attack versus not exercise, despite them having a significant life event that can shorten and worsen their life expectancy? Why do some people choose not to exercise after a heart attack, whereas some people do? And this is a why question that clearly extends to human behavior. And why questions have informed my research program over the years. And my research very much focuses on psychosocial, contextual dimensions of heart disease, mostly heart failure and heart attack. And in relation to these why questions and complexity theory, I draw on critical realism, which we'll hear a little bit more about later, to inform qualitative research, quantitative research, systematic review, and broadly to address what we can do to change and improve patient health outcomes, focusing not only on people, but also people and programs, and not only people and programs, but people, programs, and places. Seeing the answers to improving patient health outcomes, not in one realm, but through the complex interaction of factors across realms, people, programs, and places. And this is my research. We're also going to be talking and making references to some key papers as we move through the webinar. 3 key papers that I would draw your attention to that provide a little bit more background to some of the concepts I'm going to discuss. Paper on complex critical realism in advances in nursing science, published to the late stage of 2009. A paper in the BMJ about what football or soccer can teach us about researching complex health interventions. And finally, a paper in social science and medicine on what are the components of complex interventions, theorizing approaches to parts, powers, and the whole intervention. And we'll talk about these papers throughout the webinar today. Okay, so let's come back to the concept of complexity. And when we use that word, what does it actually mean? When should we use it? And when shouldn't we use it as well? And we hear complexity often used interchangeably with other terms. That's because the origin of the term complexity in the applied social sciences goes all the way back to the 1960s. And whilst complexity thinking may seem new to us today in qualitative and quantitative research, it's actually 50 or 60 years old. It has its roots in cybernetics and systems science and artificial intelligence in the 60s. Moving forward into the 1970s, was used in dynamic systems theory and social systems theory, agent-based modeling and neural networking. Through the 80s, having expression as an adjunct to chaos theory, incorporated in sociological concepts of emergence and data mining, through more recent research movements focusing on system dynamics and multi-agent modeling. So whilst complexity thinking seems new, it's actually been well established for 50 or 60 years in the social sciences. What is then complexity? This thing that goes back 40 or 50 years. What do we mean when we use that term, and when shouldn't we use it? And if we remember only one thing from this webinar, it should be when to use the term complex appropriately. Not to use it when things are simple, and in particular, not to use it when complicated would be a better term. Let's look and see where that comes from. Well, sometimes in our clinical guidelines, and in our approaches to quantitative research, and in our approaches to life, we can see things in simple terms. When things are simple, and we want to get the outcomes we seek from our interventions, we can follow simple recipe-like approaches. A good example of a simple intervention is a recipe, whereby with a small number of factors and a highly controlled environment, if you follow the steps in that recipe, you are highly likely to get the outcome that you seek. Why? Because in this conception, reality is simple. You merely follow the recipe for success, and you're very, very likely to attain that success. Why? Because in this approach, reality is simple. Not everyone agrees with this though, and this approach can't be used in every situation, because the reality is social life is not as controlled, not as regular, and not as straightforward as simple situations like an oven. An alternative view based on this view is built on complicatedness. And when we say something is complicated, what does that actually mean? Well, things are complicated when formula have ready application to particular situations, whereby if we follow that formula and include everything that's important and salient in the situation in our formula, and we draw on our expertise and historical precedent, learning about what's happened on previous occasions, and we fill in all the gaps in our formula, we can then be highly likely to attain success in our interventions. It is indeed rocket science. Incorporate everything in our equations, and we're very, very likely to put our rocket into space successfully. Why? Because reality in this view is complicated. It is indeed, if you like, rocket science. Complexity theory and complexity approaches, however, write against these two approaches. The view here is that complexity approaches would say that, well, gaps can and don't readily present themselves in our research. And whilst complicated approaches may fill in the gaps in relation to formula, sometimes in reality, we don't know everything that's important. We don't know that it even is influential, or even that it might exist. And complicated approaches, yes, they see the secret of successful interventions as filling the gaps, if you like, quantifying everything that's important, filling the gaps in the research, and then attaining a more successful outcome from your intervention. This concept would be like filling in the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, incorporating all those missing pieces in your formula, and then being highly likely to attain your outcome because reality is complicated. Complex approaches would draw attention to the weaknesses in this view. Complex approaches would say, well, in reality, there's so much going on, we don't even know necessarily what gaps exist. Nor can we necessarily measure everything that's important for those gaps. Formula have limited application because there's always so much going on in our systems. And even each parts of these systems have multiple components and react in multiple different ways. And there's also interactions that go on between elements of this complex system that cause changes and fluidity and flux in these complex systems over time. Why? Because reality is complex. Bringing up a child is complex. And those of you who've got 2 children will identify with this. You can do the same thing with one child as you do with your second child and get very, very different outcomes. Why? Because reality is complex. And understanding the difference between what is complicated and what is complex is important. People often use these words interchangeably, and they're not. When we say to recap things are complicated, we recognize that they require formula, they draw on expertise, historical precedent. The past experience can clearly inform our current situations, but if we fill in all the gaps in our formula, we draw on our expertise and historical precedents. If steps are followed, we are relatively well assured of attaining success. Conversely, when things are complicated, when things are complex, formula have limited application. Too many factors are potentially involved. We don't necessarily even know all the factors that are involved, and past experience provide limited assurance of future success. And because every situation is also unique, even if we follow the same steps as we had before in our intervention, success is in doubt. Why? Because reality is not complicated, it is in fact complex. What does that mean in terms of interventions then? And here I'd like to refer you to this paper about what football teaches us about researching complex health interventions. And in particular, in relation to soccer or football, the concept of complexity. And when we think about this game of football, we're dealing with a sport that has a single socially agreed upon primary outcome. And that primary outcome is goals scored. So when we care about football, our primary outcome is goals that our team scores versus the goals that the other team scores. And from this basis in our primary outcome, I'd like us to think about this question. Who would you rather have on your football team? The player on the left here, myself, or the player on the right, Lionel Messi, who is the Argentinian player who plays in La Liga for Barcelona, who's the 4 times World Football Player of the Year. And when we think about football and caring about goals as our primary outcome, which of these components would you rather have in your team, Clark or Messi? Here is Lionel Messi. He has a bad dress sense, I think, but as you can see in football terms, with his Ballon d'Or, he's been very successful on the world football stage. But in many ways, we actually don't look that different. You can see this fantastic soccer player here, poised and ready to strike at the goal. And when you think about Clark versus Messi, I'd like to put the case to you that we're in fact very similar. We both have 2 legs and 2 feet. We have brown mousy hair. We're under 6 feet tall. In our respective countries, we're in our top income decile. And we both score goals regularly. So in this way, I'd like to put it to you in terms of components in our intervention, we are effectively 2 peas in a pod. Well, I can guess that some of you are quite skeptical and more favoring Messi in your team. Why would this be persuasive? Well, this is really an issue ontologically about what matters more and what matters most in our interventions. And when you think about all the different factors that we talked about here, whilst these things are potentially easily measurable or readily apparent, they're not necessarily the things that are most ontologically important in attaining or fostering attainment of our primary outcome. So whilst they can be measured readily, whilst to the casual observer they may be really obvious, they're not necessarily that important. They don't matter more and they don't matter most compared to other elements that may be less measurable, such as football ability, physical prowess, football skill, intellectual abilities around football. And this is, if you like, a theorization about what's important in terms of components of an intervention and why it's not necessarily always what's most readily measurable that's what's most ontologically important in attaining the effect of the intervention. And when we see complexity in this sporting scenario, but we then start to think of our intervention research in the same way, it can beg the question to us about what matters more or what matters most in our interventions and to what degree we can or are measuring it. And we have to be careful that we are not measuring elements that are superficially obvious but less important or influential in terms of outcome, such as football ability in this scenario. Seeing complexity in this way can also help us address other questions about our intervention. How can we come to know even what's most important in terms of our intervention? What theory or background knowledge can we draw upon there to then think about how we use qualitative and quantitative research to identify and address what's important and explore its effects? How, for example, does context matter, moderate or mediate what's going on in terms of the complexity here? How can we measure what's most important? Maybe things that are important can be measured, and we need to use qualitative research or mixed method research to identify their influence and effects more. How do elements of the parts of our intervention exist and interact with each other, and how do things change over time? And these are all fascinating questions for intervention researchers, but qualitative and quantitative research can be used together to identify and explore what's important. Sometimes as well, this approach casts doubt on the questions that we even ask about our research. So for example, in many interdisciplinary areas, we might beg the question, do our interventions work? Or does a particular intervention work? And from a complexity perspective, this question almost doesn't make sense. It's akin to asking the question, do Manchester United win? Well, of course, the response to that would be, well, against who? Against a local team from the League of Ireland, or against Barcelona, Real Madrid? Would be very, very different answers. And also, in what context? Is it a friendly, where nothing really matters, win or lose? Or is it the final of the Champions League? And at what time? Is this 30 years ago? Is this in the present day? And all these different caveats lead us to the conclusion, well, it depends. And so we can't necessarily even ask that question, do interventions work? From a complexity perspective, alternatively, we have to ask a different question, a question that addresses the outcomes are neither uniform or chaotic, but somewhat patterned, and ask the question, in what context Manchester United would win, against whom? And we're going to think about that in a moment in relation to an approach called realist evaluation. So that's the lessons that football can teach us about researching complex health interventions. And that's the lesson that football can take to us in telling us and showing us that we can't even ask the question, does an intervention work any longer? We have to ask a deeper question, a question that addresses complexities in this situation far more. And these kinds of questions address the characteristics of complex systems. The view of causation implicit in complex systems, recognizing that complex systems change and evolve, learn and adapt, have distributed control, and have central characteristics associated with emergence and interactions, non-feedback loops, and linearity. So for example here, views of causation associated with complexity don't see reality as being simply superficial, a successionist approach to causation, where in situation A, do B, and C will happen. This is that simple view again. Instead, complexity approaches would view our generative approach to causation as requiring many, many factors to be in place in order to attain the event or the outcome we are seeking from our intervention, the so-called generative approach to causation. And when we approach interventions with this generative review, we can't necessarily see everything being dependent on the intervention. We have to recognize that many facets of the intervention can potentially influence things, and also there may be dimensions of context. But of course, this reductionist view doesn't necessarily address or assimilate these deeper questions. They will just take measurements in this diagram, for example, at point A and point B, and look at the differences between them, rather than unpacking what interventions are and what context the intervention is provided in. Complexity approaches also recognize that interventions change and evolve over time. Just like a football team will change and evolve its tactics over time, and its opponent will change and evolve their tactics over time. So our interventions are fluid. They evolve and change and adapt and respond to what's going on about them. And those providing the intervention may well learn and adapt over time as well. Interventions have this concept of distributed control, whereby there's not a single point in the intervention that's most important. Just like there's not one single player in a football team that's always most important. But other elements can come in and influence the outcomes from our intervention in different situations and times. Just like a referee, for example, can influence the result of a football game. So there can be shifts in what influences and controls our outcomes from our interventions over time. Complex systems also have characteristics of emergence, where many things are going on in our intervention, and these things can interact with each other and produce new phenomena. So, for example, if many different people are providing our intervention, some of these people may interact with that intervention and be particularly effective in providing that intervention, and thereby causing particularly powerful and influential effects on our outcomes in ways that we perhaps can't even readily identify or measure. And finally, briefly, interventions interact with the environments and the components in which they're provided. They have feedback loops whereby they affect themselves over time, and they also have a kind of non-linearity whereby there's not necessarily a consistent flow of actions and reactions going on between our intervention and those providing it, but complex chains of events. And there's this sense of almost chaos going on here, with qualitative and quantitative research trying to be used to unpack and keep track of all the different actions and reactions in our interventions that are not linear. So when we approach the different interventions in our disciplines in relation to this complexity view, we stop seeing interventions as integrative wholes, similar to how tablets might be seen in a traditional pharmacological study in an RCT. And we start viewing interventions as far more multifaceted, far more prone to flux, far more ultimately complex than this singular, unitary, holistic view. And this has been captured, for example, in policy. And I would draw your attention to the MRC, the Medical Research Council approach to developing and evaluating complex interventions. And the MRC approach has been used quite a lot in health since the year 2000, and with the subsequent guidelines in 2006, to start to unpack this complexity. So, for example, in the approach advocated by the framework, recognizing that interventions are multifaceted and they require development that draws on quite a clear evidence base and has clear theorization about what the intervention is and how it works. This concept of modeling the process and the outcomes, and then moving towards feasibility and piloting, whereby we take that complex intervention and we introduce it in a complex context. And then we evaluate it, assessing its effectiveness, but also understanding its change process, invoking concepts, for example, like context and mechanisms. And then in relation to its implementation, assessing its fidelity, assessing to what degree the intervention was provided in a way that reflected the way that we planned for it to be provided. This is the MRC framework for complex evaluations. So taking these approaches together, this complexity lens, this causes us to think quite radically differently about what an intervention is. Not this single unitary whole, but something that's far more componentized, that's far more multifaceted, and influences outcomes and phenomena in the world in far more complex ways. And for those of us planning to do research, it also begs the question about what needs to be included in our intervention research. At what point, for example, do we have to start designing our intervention using approaches like qualitative research about what's going on in the world? In terms of our intervention study design, to what degree do we need to unpack what is going on in our intervention and the black box, if you like, between the intervention and its outcomes? How is the intervention influencing outcomes, i.e. what mechanisms through which is the intervention acting, and how does context and other factors moderate this influence? And this brings us to realist evaluation. And many of you may have heard about realist evaluation, which has addressed this issue, for example, in relation to complexity approaches around do Manchester United win? Around simply asking, does an intervention work? And instead, realist evaluation asks, what works for whom, when, and why? And this approach has been based now for about 20 years, drawing on the work of Ray Pawson and Nick Tilley. So I'd like to finish the webinar off today just with a simple overview of what realist evaluation is. Realistic evaluation had its origins in the lack of replicability of success of intervention work. That often interventions that are successful in one setting aren't successful or is successful in another, and we don't necessarily know why. And we have a lack of ability in our research methods to generate insights into reasons for these variations. And finally, in relation to how we can explore that why, traditional evaluation and trial methods have placed a lack of attention to ontology on what is really going on in existing intervention research. And realistic evaluation was an attempt to write ontology back in, to bring explanation back in, not just exploring whether interventions work or not, but looking at why they work when they work and why they don't when they don't, and addressing this why question in some kinds of depth. And realistic evaluation was initially used in relation to CCTV interventions. These cameras that can exist in public places in many of our cities and our towns that research would suggest are successful at reducing crime in some areas, but not successful in reducing crime in other areas. And realistic evaluation was initially developed to understand why, with a view to then how you could position, to implement, and to harness with other interventions, potentially CCTV to reduce crime more uniformly, so that there were more winners from this intervention rather than more losers. How to understand realistic evaluation? Well, realistic evaluation really views the power of the intervention not lying in the intervention itself, but instead through the ways in which the intervention works and the context in which the intervention is provided. So the power of the intervention is not inherent in the intervention, but is manifest through the way it works and how context moderates that. I'll give you an example here that may put some meat on the bones. And if you will indulge me here, I'd like to go back to a place that has its role in our childhoods. And this is Tickletown. And I'm drawing here an example that one of my colleagues, Jeff Wong, has used before. And Tickletown, which if you're a fan of the Mr. Men will know, is the place where Mr. Tickle lives. This is Mr. Tickle. And Mr. Tickle's favorite intervention, unsurprisingly, is the tickle. And he administers this tickle through his hands to suspecting, unsuspecting, knowing and unknowing members of Tickletown. And this is the book by Roger Hargreaves that details Mr. Tickle's adventures with his intervention. This is what the intervention looks like. And you can see Mr. Tickle here administering his intervention to Mr. Grumpy. And a simple ontological view here would be tickle plus recipient equals laugh. So breaking it down in the traditional PICO fashion, we have a population of other people. We have our intervention, which is our tickle, usually administered by Mr. Tickle's wiggling digits. He only has 4 of them. Our comparison here is no tickle, and our outcome would be what? Well, Mr. Tickle's primary outcome is that people will laugh. And the power of the intervention he thinks is in his tickling. Surely everyone who's tickled will laugh. But of course, we know that while some people will laugh, perhaps members of Mr. Tickle's immediate social circle, people who know what he stands for and can prepare themselves for what will come, but not everyone will laugh from his tickle. And if you've ever tried to tickle someone you don't know on a bus, you will know that the expected outcome may not be a laugh. In actual fact, you risk social stigma and indeed various forms of harassment, sweeps, and possibly even arrest for trying to administer your tickle intervention in this way, because the power of the tickle is not inherent in it. The tickle acts in relation to particular mechanisms that are moderated by context, the social context in which the tickle exists. And if you were to be tickled by a stranger, very readily you would see and recognize and understand this. And in this way, realist evaluation would say the power of an intervention is never inherent in the intervention. It's always related to the mechanisms of its effect and the broader context in which that effect occurs. And that can color absolutely the very nature of the outcome you will get. Why? Well, because the power of interventions are not in the interventions themselves. They're in the mechanisms through which they are provided and the context in which those interventions occur. So when we think about randomized controlled trials and we think about interventions, think about Mr. Tickle. Think about the social stigma of the tickle and recognize the power of an intervention is not in itself. It is in the context in which it's administered and the mechanisms through which that happens. This has been used in relation to research to address why some people exercise after a heart attack while others don't. This realist evaluation approach has been used to identify why some breastfeeding interventions work and why also others do not, or why some school feeding programs work and others do not. Recognizing and acknowledging that social setting is one of the most important things here, not necessarily the inherent nature of the intervention in and of itself. And when we start to see interventions as multifaceted in this way, we can start to problematize some of the words that we use. So, for example, you'll hear the concept of components of complex interventions talked about a lot in relation to complex interventions. I talk about it a lot in this paper in Social Science and Medicine on what the components of complex interventions are in healthcare. And our analysis showed that people who say they are talking about components in complex interventions may be referring to one of 7 different things. They may be referring to components as non-existent parts and powers, or they may be referring to components as irrelevant parts and powers. Viewing interventions as simple wholes that have simple powers that may or may not lead to changes in outcomes. Alternatively to these 2 views, a third approach may be used that sees components as undifferentiated powerful parts, or fourthly, components as being powerful higher order parts with non-existent lower parts, or fifthly, components as powerful higher order parts with non-powerful lower order parts, or alternatively, components as powerful higher and lower order parts, or finally, as components as powerful parts and the whole. All these different views about what components are often implicit. And so we have to always ask ourselves when we use terms like components, what do we actually mean relative to the components of the intervention, the parts of the intervention, and the powers of the intervention. Merely saying components is not enough unless we start to unpack what that means ontologically. And if you want to read more about this, then please read the Social Science and Medicine paper. So time's getting on now. We're about 3/4 of the way through our time. So I'd like to finish up here and just rephrase what we talked about. We focused on complexity research. We thought about components and different views of components that we can have in our research. We've thought about mechanisms and also the power of context in relation to our research. And we've also thought and recognized how we can learn from elements like football and soccer and sport for how we research and understand interventions in complex ways in our own research using qualitative and quantitative research. Thinking about the ways that complexity concepts can be suitable to examine research questions in our area. And thinking in particular, how can qualitative research help us to do this? So there we go. That's our run through. If you want to follow up with any of the key references, please feel free to access these. If you want a copy of the slides, then the email for the slides is at the bottom left there. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. That was absolutely fantastic. I don't think I've ever enjoyed the explanation of context or complexity so much, and definitely all those I suppose Mr. Tickle and Messi. It's definitely made a lot more sense in my head. Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite people, if they'd like to use the chat or the question and answer function to ask any questions, if they have any questions. While they're doing that, there's just a couple of questions here in the room, Alex, if that's okay.
That's great. And if people could say who they are and where they are, that would be great.
Perfect. So the first question is from Linda Nichanon, who's here in the Quests group, who's in the School of Nursing and Midwifery here. And her question is just in relation to, I suppose, terminology around process evaluation versus realist evaluation. So you mentioned, I think, the MRC framework for complex interventions, and they also have a process evaluation guidance recently, which kind of mentioned things that you were talking about, like context, implementation, and mechanisms of action. So I suppose her question was just in relation to terminology used. So they would have described some of that stuff as process evaluation, whereas you were talking about realist evaluation. Can you just tell us, are they the same thing? Do they overlap, or how might they be different when you're terming one or opposed to the other?
Well, thank you, Linda. That's a great question. And I'm familiar with the MRC recent process guidance on intervention research and research generally. I think it's good to see concepts like complexity and mechanisms and components across these different approaches. Some of the challenges can be merely mentioning the words isn't enough. And I think if you look at the original MRC guidance from 2006 and also 2000, it talks about the terms a lot, but doesn't really define and unpack what the nature of those terms are. So for example, components is a good textbook example of that, where just saying the notion of components could mean 7 different things. So I think any of these approaches, what's most useful for us is to think about where and what do these terms actually mean, and then try to unpack more where they fit into broader research. I think there's lots of overlap between process evaluation and realistic evaluation, but again, sometimes if we're not defining our key terms, it's not that clear what the implications are for the research of the complexity concept. Finally, I would say, the recent process evaluation MRC guidance, I think, is more comprehensive. There's no substitute for thinking philosophically, I don't think, and understanding conceptually what we mean when we're using the concepts, and always coming back to those concepts.
Fantastic. I think she looks like that's answered her question. Thank you so much, Alex. I have a question myself, I suppose. So my name is Elaine Toomey, and I'm a postdoc researcher in the Health Behaviour Change Research Group here in Galway. And I suppose I'm just wondering about, when you're assessing realist evaluation outcomes, if you're doing this within a feasibility study of, say, a clinical trial or something, or an intervention, how do you avoid overlapping with, say, feasibility outcomes, so things like recruitment rates and that kind of stuff, and even like, I suppose, when you're looking at the context it's in, and then specific outcomes that are, I suppose, more specific to the realist evaluation side?
It's an interesting question, Elaine. I think, thinking about the the nature of the intervention, the cycle of the research using the kind of MRC stages, whereby, you know, using some of the language there about feasibility or fidelity, and you know, incorporating where you can qualitative methods and quantitative methods to understand what's going on. Perhaps some of the issues that you're experiencing or the differences in outcomes may be related to one thing but not the other. It may be an issue of fidelity or maybe an issue of context, for example, and really trying to unpack what's going on there. Every problem or every tension that you can identify is data, and building into your research approach a kind of curiosity-driven approach whereby nothing is seen to be inherently problematic, but everything is an opportunity to learn and explore different facets of the intervention, from the feasibility side of it, through the fidelity side of it, through to the context side of it, and look at all the clues as to what's really going on there. Things may well not fit into regular single boxes. And that's another important thing to identify. The concept may be across all these different three areas. So not being able to provide a definitive sense of where the issue is, I think, is also important. This comes back to the concept of when you have a complexity lens, you see things in complex ways and you ask complex questions. But of course, then you naturally often get complex answers that don't readily fit into a nice, neat box.
Thank you. And I think for me, it's trying to, you know, to report things, because when they don't fit into a nice, neat box, it's very hard to figure out how to structure a paper and report things maybe together, or maybe they need to be in separate papers. So especially when it comes to that feasibility and then the complexity stuff.
Yes, and government often likes nice, neat answers, as do journals, as does the media. But our view would be perhaps things are more complex than that.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think we might have one more question. Just it kind of popped up there and it's kind of gone away from me again now. So trying to see if it's here somewhere. I don't think. No, I think it's gone again. So if anybody has any last questions that they'd like to ask, now's your time to do it. I'd just like to thank you again, Alex, for such a wonderful presentation, and thank you for getting up this morning to do it, because obviously you're in a different time zone for us.
No problem. I see a couple of questions from Rusano and Lisa. Do I see those correct?
Can you read them yourself, Alex? I can't seem to find those. Oh.
Do they have to type them?
If they could type them, that would be great, yeah, so that we can have a record of them. So if you have any questions, if you can just type. Oh, here we have one from Lisa Wills. Yes. So Lisa says, complexity theory can be used as a framework for designing interventions as well as a framework for analyzing data from an intervention. Is that right?
Great. Yes, Lisa, I would say. I think it's generally best if you can incorporate your complexity lens through everything, you know, from the conception through to the design as well. But yes, you can include that complexity lens at different stages to give a different sense of what you're going to look for in terms of questions, and then the various concepts that might be in the answers that you find.
Fantastic. Do you see any more questions, Alex? Or
I see one from Rusano.
Is that in the attendees bit?
Yes, it is.
I think that means that she might have just left. I think that's what that means. So if it pops up in the Q&A section or the chat section, then that's where the questions will be.
Okay.
I think that's all that I can see on this side anyway. So thank you very much, Alex. That was really fantastic. So interesting. Looking forward to that at some point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.